The Merovingians were a Salian Frankish dynasty that ruled the Franks for nearly 300 years in a region known as Francia in Latin. Beginning in the middle of the 5th century, their territory largely corresponded to ancient Gaul as well as the Roman provinces of Rhaetia, Germania Superior and the southern part of Germania. The Merovingian dynasty was founded by Childeric I, the son of Merovech, leader of the Salian Franks. But it was his famous son Clovis I who united all of Gaul under Merovingian rule. After the death of Clovis there were frequent clashes between different branches of the family. But when threatened by its neighbors, the Merovingians presented a strong united front. During the final century of Merovingian rule, the kings were increasingly pushed into a ceremonial role. The Merovingian rule ended in March 752 when Pope Zachary formally deposed Childeric III. Zachary's successor, Pope Stephen II, confirmed and anointed Pepin the Short in 754, beginning the Carolingian monarchy. The Merovingian ruling family were sometimes referred to as the long-haired kings by contemporaries, as their long hair distinguished them among the Franks, who commonly cut their hair short. The term Merovingian comes from medieval Latin Merovingi or Merovingi, an alteration of an unattested Old Dutch form, akin to their dynasty's Old English name Merowioing, with the final ing being a typical patronymic suffix. Origins. The Merovingian dynasty owes its name to the semi-legendary Merovech, leader of the Salian Franks. The victories of his son Childeric I against the Visigoths, Saxons, and Alemanni established the basis of Merovingian land. Childeric's son Clovis I went on to unite most of Gaul north of the Loire under his control around 486, when he defeated Syagrius, the Roman ruler in those parts. He won the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni in 496, at which time, according to Gregory of Tours, Clovis adopted his wife Clotilda's Catholic Christian faith. He subsequently went on to decisively defeat the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse in the Battle of Vouillé in 507. After Clovis's death, his kingdom was partitioned among his 4 sons, and over the next century this tradition of partition continued, even when several Merovingian kings simultaneously ruled their own realms. The kingdom, not unlike the late Roman Empire, was conceived of as a single entity ruled collectively by these several kings, among whom a turn of events could result in the reunification of the whole kingdom under a single ruler. Leadership among the early Merovingians was probably based on mythical descent and alleged divine patronage, expressed in terms of continued military success. In 1906, the British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie suggested that the Marvingi recorded by Ptolemy as living near the Rhine were the ancestors of the Merovingian dynasty. History. Upon Clovis's death in 511, the Merovingian kingdom included all of Gaul except Burgundy and all of Germania Magna except Saxony. To the outside, the kingdom, even when divided under different kings, maintained unity and conquered Burgundy in 534. After the fall of the Ostrogoths, the Franks also conquered Provence. After this their borders with Italy and Visigothic Septimania remained fairly stable. Internally, the kingdom was divided among Clovis's sons and later among his grandsons, and frequently saw war between the different kings, who quickly allied among themselves and against one another. The death of one king created conflict between the surviving brothers and the deceased sons, with differing outcomes. Later, conflicts were intensified by the personal feud around Brunhilde. However, yearly warfare often did not constitute general devastation but took on an almost ritual character, with established rules and norms. Eventually, Clotaire II in 613 reunited the entire Frankish realm under one ruler. Later divisions produced the stable units of Austrasia, Neustria, Burgundy and Aquitania. The frequent wars had weakened royal power, while the aristocracy had made great gains and procured enormous concessions from the kings in return for their support. These concessions saw the very considerable power of the king parceled out and retained by leading Kemites and Usus. Very little is in fact known about the course of the 7th century due to a scarcity of sources, but Merovingians remained in power until the 8th century. Clotaires' son Dagobert I, who sent troops to Spain and pagan Slavic territories in the east, is commonly seen as the last powerful Merovingian king. Later kings are known as Warfenants, despite the fact that only the last two kings did nothing. The kings, even strong-willed men like Dagobert II and Chilperic II, were not the main agents of political conflicts, leaving this role to their mayors of the palace, who increasingly substituted their own interests for their kings. Many kings came to the throne at a young age and died in the prime of life, weakening royal power further. The conflict between mayors was ended when the Austrasians under Pepin the Middle triumphed in 687 in the Battle of Tertry. After this, Pepin, though not a king, was the political ruler of the Frankish kingdom and left this position as a heritage to his sons. It was now the sons of the mayor that divided the realm among each other under the rule of a single king. After Pepin's long rule, his son Charles Martel assumed power, fighting against nobles and his own stepmother. His reputation for ruthlessness further undermined the king's position. Under Charles Martel's leadership, the Franks defeated the Moors at the Battle of Tours in 732, limiting the expansion of Islam onto the European continent. During the last years of his life he even ruled without a king, though he did not assume royal dignity. His sons Carloman and Pepin again appointed a Merovingian figurehead to stem rebellion on the kingdom's periphery. However, in 751, Pepin finally displaced the last Merovingian and, with the support of the nobility and the blessing of Pope Zachary, became one of the Frankish kings. Government and law. The Merovingian king redistributed conquered wealth among his followers, both material wealth and the land including its indentured peasantry, though these powers were not absolute. As Rouche points out, when he died his property was divided equally among his heirs as though it were private property. The kingdom was a form of patrimony. Some scholars have attributed this to the Merovingians lacking a sense of res publica, but other historians have criticized this view as an oversimplification. The kings appointed magnates to be Kemites, charging them with defense, administration, and the judgment of disputes. This happened against the backdrop of a newly isolated Europe without its Roman systems of taxation and bureaucracy. The Franks having taken over administration as they gradually penetrated into the thoroughly Romanized west and south of Gaul. The counts had to provide armies, enlisting their militaires and endowing them with land in return. These armies were subject to the king's call for military support. Annual national assemblies of the nobles and their armed retainers decided major policies of war-making. The army also acclaimed new kings by raising them on its shields, continuing an ancient practice that made the king leader of the warrior band. Furthermore, the king was expected to support himself with the products of his private domain, which was called the fisc. This system developed in time into feudalism, and expectations of royal self-sufficiency lasted until the Hundred Years' War. Trade declined with the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and agricultural estates were mostly self-sufficient. The remaining international trade was dominated by Middle Eastern merchants, often Jewish rabbinites. Merovingian law was not universal law equally applicable to all, it was applied to each man according to his origin. Ripuarian Franks were subject to their own lex ripuaria, codified at a late date, while the so-called lex Salica of the Salian clans first tentatively codified in 511, was invoked under medieval exigencies as late as the Valois era. In this the Franks lagged behind the Burgundians and the Visigoths, that they had no universal Roman base law. In Merovingian times, law remained in the rote memorization of Rachenbergs, who memorized all the precedents on which it was based. For Merovingian law did not admit of the concept of creating new law, only of maintaining tradition. Nor did its Germanic traditions offer any code of civil law required of urbanized society, such as Justinian I caused to be assembled and promulgated in the Byzantine Empire. The few surviving Merovingian edicts are almost entirely concerned with settling divisions of estates among heirs. Religion and culture. Christianity was introduced to the Franks by their contact with Gallo-Romanic culture and later further spread by monks. The most famous of these missionaries is Saint Columbanus, an Irish monk who enjoyed great influence with Queen Balthild. Merovingian kings and queens used the newly forming ecclesiastical power structure to their advantage. Monasteries and episcopal seats were shrewdly awarded to elites who supported the dynasty. Extensive parcels of land were donated to monasteries to exempt those lands from royal taxation and to preserve them within the family. The family maintained dominance over the monastery by appointing family members as abbots. Extra sons and daughters who could not be married off were sent to monasteries so that they would not threaten the inheritance of older children. This pragmatic use of monasteries ensured close ties between elites and monastic properties. Numerous Merovingians who served as bishops and abbots, or who generously funded abbeys and monasteries, were rewarded with sainthood. The outstanding handful of Frankish saints who were not of the Merovingian kinship nor the family alliances that provided Merovingian counts and dukes deserve a closer inspection for that fact alone. Like Gregory of Tours, they were almost without exception from the Gallo-Roman aristocracy in regions south and west of Merovingian control. The most characteristic form of Merovingian literature is represented by the lives of the saints. Merovingian hagiography did not set out to reconstruct a biography in the Roman or the modern sense, but to attract and hold popular devotion by the formulas of elaborate literary exercises, through which the Frankish Church channeled popular piety within orthodox channels, defined the nature of sanctity and retained some control over the posthumous cult that developed spontaneously at burial sites, where the life force of the saint lingered, to do good for the votary. The Vitae Miracula, for impressive miracles, were an essential element of Merovingian hagiography, were read aloud on saints' feast days. Many Merovingian saints, and the majority of female saints, were local ones, venerated only within strictly circumscribed regions. The cults were revived in the High Middle Ages, when the population of women in religious orders increased enormously. Judith Oliver noted 5 Merovingian female saints in the Diocese of Liege who appeared in a long list of saints in a late 13th century Psalter hours. The characteristics they shared with many Merovingian female saints may be mentioned. Regina Ulfa of Incourt, a 7th century virgin in French-speaking Brabant of the ancestral line of the Dukes of Brabant, fled from a proposal of marriage to live isolated in the forest, where a curative spring sprang forth at her touch. Ermelindis of Meldet, a 6th century virgin related to Pepin I, inhabited several isolated villas. Bega of Andena, the mother of Pepin II, founded 7 churches in Andena during her widowhood. The purely legendary Oda of Amay was drawn into the Carolingian line by spurious genealogy in her 13th century Vita, which made her the mother of Arnulf, Bishop of Metz, but she has been identified with the historical Saint Crauduara. Finally, the widely venerated Gertrude of Nivelles, sister of Bega in the Carolingian ancestry, was abbess of a nunnery established by her mother. The vitae of 6 late Merovingian saints that illustrate the political history of the era have been translated and edited by Paul Foraker and Richard A. Gerberding, and presented with Liber Historiae Francorum, to provide some historical context. Significant Merovingian saints: Kings Guntram, King of Burgundy; Sigebert III, King of Austrasia; Dagobert II, King of Austrasia, son of the former; Queens and abbesses: Genovefa, Virgin of Paris; Clothilda, Queen of the Franks; Monegund, widow and recluse of Tours; Radegund, Thuringian princess who founded a monastery at Poitiers; Rusticula, abbess of Arles; Caesaria II, abbess of St. John of Arles; Glodesind, abbess in Metz; Burgundifera, abbess of Moutiers; Sedalberga, abbess of Laon; Richtruda, founding abbess of Marchiennes; Itta, founding abbess of Nivelles; Bega, abbess of Andenne; Gertrude of Nivelles, abbess of Nivelles, presented in the life of Saint Gertrude; Aldegonde, abbess of Maubeuges; Waltruda, abbess of Mons; Balthold, Queen of the Franks, presented in the life of Lady Bathilde, Queen of the Franks; Eustadiola, widow of Bourges; Bertia, abbess of Chelles; Anstruda, abbess of Laon; Ostriberta, abbess of Pavilly; bishops and abbots: Amandus, one of the great Christian saints of Flanders; Arnulf, bishop of Metz; Ordwin of Rouen, presented in the life of Ordua, bishop of Rouen; Ornemond, presented in the deeds of Ornemond; Eligius, chief counselor to Dagobert I and bishop of Noyon-Tournai; Gregory of Tours, bishop of Tours and historian; Hubertus, apostle of the Ardennes and first bishop of Liege; Lambert, bishop of Maastricht; Leodegar, bishop of Autun, presented in the suffering of Ludegar; Praejectus, the suffering of Praejectus; Praetextatus, bishop of Rouen and friend of Gregory; Remigius, bishop of Reims, who baptized Clovis I. Historiography and sources. A limited number of contemporary sources describe the history of the Merovingian Franks, but those that survive cover the entire period from Clovis's succession to Childric's deposition. First among chroniclers of the age is the canonized Bishop of Tours, Gregory of Tours. His Decem Libri Historiarum is a primary source for the reigns of the sons of Clotaire II and their descendants until Gregory's own death in 594. The next major source, far less organized than Gregory's work, is the Chronicle of Fredegar, begun by Fredegar but continued by unknown authors. It covers the period from 584 to 641, though its continuators, under Carolingian patronage, extended it to 768. After the close of the Merovingian era, it is the only primary narrative source for much of its period. Since its restoration in 1938 it has been housed in the ducal collection of the Staatsbibliothek Binkelsbingen. The only other major contemporary source is the Liber Historiae Francorum, an anonymous adaptation of Gregory's work apparently ignorant of Fredegar's chronicle. Its author ends with a reference to Theuderic IV's sixth year, which would be 727. It was widely read, though it was undoubtedly a piece of unnulfing work, and its biases cause it to mislead. Aside from these chronicles, the only surviving reservoirs of historiography are letters, capitularies, and the like. Clerical men such as Gregory and Sulpicius the Pious were letter writers, though relatively few letters survive. Edicts, grants, and judicial decisions survive, as well as the famous Lex Salica, mentioned above. From the reign of Clotaire II and Dagobert I survive many examples of the royal position as the supreme justice and final arbiter. There are also survived biographical lives of saints of the period, for instance Saint Eligius and Leodegar, written soon after their subjects' deaths. Finally, archaeological evidence cannot be ignored as a source for information, at the very least, on the Frankish mode of life. Among the greatest discoveries of lost objects was the 1653 accidental uncovering of Childeric I's tomb in the Church of St. Brice in Tournai. The grave objects included a golden bull's head and the famous golden insects on which Napoleon modelled his coronation cloak. In 1957, the sepulchre of a Merovingian woman at the time believed to be Clotaire second wife, Aregunde, was discovered in Saint Denis Basilica in Paris. The funerary clothing and jewelry were reasonably well preserved, giving us a look into the costume of the time. Numismatics. Byzantine coinage was in use in Francia before Theudebert I began minting his own money at the start of his reign. He was the first to issue distinctly Merovingian coinage on gold coins struck in his royal workshop. Theudebert is shown in the pearl-studded regalia of the Byzantine emperor. Childebert I is shown in profile in the ancient style, wearing a toga and a diadem. The solidus and trions were minted in Francia between 534 and 679. The denarius appeared later, in the name of Childeric II and various non-royals around 673 to 675. A Carolingian denarius replaced the Merovingian one, and the Frisian penning, in Gaul from 755 to the 11th century. Merovingian coins are on display at the Monnaie de Paris in Paris. There are Merovingian gold coins at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Cabinet des Médailles. Language. Yitzhak Hen stated that it seems certain that the Gallo-Roman population was far greater than the Frankish population in Merovingian Gaul, especially in regions south of the Seine, with most of the Frankish settlements being located along the lower and middle Rhine. The further south in Gaul one traveled, the weaker the Frankish influence became. Hen finds hardly any evidence for Frankish settlements south of the Loire. The absence of Frankish literature sources suggests that the Frankish language was forgotten rather rapidly after the early stage of the dynasty. Hen believes that for Neustria, Burgundy and Aquitania, colloquial Latin remained the spoken language in Gaul throughout the Merovingian period and remained so even well into the Carolingian period. However, Urban T. Holmes estimated that a Germanic language was spoken as a second tongue by public officials in Western Austrasia and Neustria as late as the 850s, and that it completely disappeared as a spoken language from these regions only during the 10th century.